My name is Jessica. I'm 38 and I live in Buffalo, New York. I used to be a detective for the city police, working on missing persons and cold cases. I left the job a few years ago, but there's one case that still haunts me to this day. It started with a phone call from an old neighborhood, one of those places where all the houses look the same and everything felt too quiet. A man had reported his wife missing. He sounded shaken, but something about his tone made my skin crawl. I arrived at their home that evening. The husband, Greg, greeted me at the door. He was polite but fidgety, avoiding eye contact. As I questioned him, his story seemed rehearsed. He said his wife, Sarah, had left for the grocery store the previous night and never came back. No fights, no arguments, just gone. But his behavior didn't match the concern of a husband who had lost his wife. He kept glancing around nervously, and when I asked to search the house, his hesitation confirmed my gut feeling. Something was off. I started with the upstairs, looking for any signs of struggle or clues that Sarah had been planning to leave, but everything seemed perfectly in place, almost too perfect. When I made my way to the basement, Greg followed, watching me closely. The basement was dimly lit, just an old washer and dryer sitting in one corner. It looked like no one had been down there in years, but then I noticed something strange, a slight breeze coming from behind a shelf. I moved the shelf aside, revealing a small door, almost like it had been hidden on purpose. My heart raced as I opened it. Behind the door was a cramped underground room. The smell hit me first, a damp, musty odor that made my stomach turn. As I stepped inside, my flashlight revealed the walls. They were covered in photographs, dozens of them, all of Sarah. Some of the photos were of her walking down the street, others of her sitting in the living room, even sleeping in their bed. They were all taken without her knowing. My heart pounded harder with every picture I saw. This wasn't just someone who missed his wife. This was someone who had been watching her for a long time. Then I found something even more disturbing, a diary. In Greg's handwriting, it detailed Sarah's daily routines. When she went to work, when she came home, what she wore, and what she ate. It was obsessive, like he was documenting every moment of her life. The last entry read, "Soon she'll be mine forever." I searched the room for any sign of Sarah. Blood, clothes, anything. But there was nothing. No body, no struggle. Just those photos and that twisted diary. I confronted Greg, but he just stared at me, his face blank. It was like he had already accepted his fate. We arrested him on suspicion, but without a body, it was hard to prove what had happened. Sarah was never found. To this day, I believe Greg had something to do with her disappearance, but the case remains unsolved. I still think about that room sometimes, the eerie silence, the way those photos stare back at me, and every time I can't help but wonder how close Sarah came to becoming another hidden secret. Trapped in that basement with no one to hear her screams, even now, years later, the memory of that cold, empty basement still sends chills down my spine. My name is Lily. I'm 45 years old and I live in Seattle, Washington. I used to work as a detective for the Seattle PD, mostly on high-profile cases. I left the field after too many unsolved cases weighed me down. But there's one case I still think about every day, a missing persons case that I never solved, and now I'm not sure I ever will. It all started about 10 years ago. A young woman named Emily went missing from her home. No signs of a break-in, no clear suspects, just gone. I worked that case for years, interviewing family, neighbors, anyone who knew her. Nothing ever felt right. But eventually the trail went cold, and I was moved to other cases. I never forgot about Emily, though. Something about her disappearance never sat well with me. Years later, I had left the field and moved into a desk job with the department. I wasn't chasing criminals anymore, just pushing papers. Then one day, I got a letter. The envelope had no return address, just my name and an old department mailing address. When I opened it, my heart stopped. The letter was signed by Emily, the same woman who had been missing for almost a decade. She wrote that she had been held captive for years by someone she trusted, a family member. The letter described her life in captivity, small details. like the blue dress she was wearing the day she was taken, or the way her captor would play old jazz records to drown out her cries for help. Things no one else could have known. The most chilling part was that Emily wasn't asking for help. She was giving me directions. She led me to an address in a rural area, far from the city. She wrote, "This is where it ends. You need to see for yourself." I couldn't ignore it. I drove out to the location, a secluded property hidden deep in the woods. The house was old, abandoned, falling apart. But there was something off about it, like someone had been there recently. I made my way inside. Dust covered everything, and the air was heavy with that familiar musty smell of a place forgotten. But the deeper I went, the more I noticed small things. Footprints in the dust, a dirty plate on a table. Someone had been living here. I finally found a hidden door in the floor of the living room, a trapdoor covered by an old rug. When I opened it, a set of stairs led down into what looked like a makeshift basement. My stomach turned as I descended. Down there, I found a room, a small, windowless room. The walls were bare concrete, the floor cold and damp. But there were signs that someone had been there recently. A mattress on the floor, shackles bolted to the walls, and a bucket in the corner. My mind raced with horror, picturing the years Emily must have spent locked down there. But the room was empty. I searched every inch of that house, but there was no sign of Emily or her captor. Whoever had been keeping her there had vanished, taking her with them. I felt sick, realizing how close I had come to solving the case, but once again, the answer slipped through my fingers. I turned the place over to the department, but they found nothing more than I had. No leads, no traces, just an empty room that told a story of suffering and isolation. To this day, I don't know what happened to Emily. I don't know if she's still alive, trapped somewhere else, just out of sight. But every time I close my eyes, I can see that room and I can feel her presence, like she's still calling out for help that I was too late to give. My name is Mark. I'm 54, and I live in a small town just outside Denver, Colorado. I was a police officer for over 25 years before I retired. There's a lot I've seen in that time, things that make you question the world around you, but one night in particular still haunts me. It's something I can't explain, and even now, I'm not sure what really happened. It was late, around midnight, when I got a call about a possible intruder at a quiet suburban home. I remember the dispatcher saying the homeowner had seen someone in their backyard. Moving toward the woods behind the house, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. When I arrived, the homeowner, an older man, was waiting on the porch, looking shaken. He pointed toward the tree line. "I saw someone," he said, his voice trembling. "They slipped into the woods just a few minutes ago." I turned on my flashlight and scanned the area, but all I saw were shadows. Still, I could feel it. The air was heavy, like something was wrong. I told the man to lock his doors and stay inside while I went to check it out. I stepped into the woods, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. The trees were so close together, it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. But then, just at the edge of my light, I caught a glimpse of the movement. A figure, tall, thin, slipping deeper into the woods. I called out, but they didn't stop, so I followed. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. The forest was eerily quiet. No animals, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching through the leaves. I kept thinking about the figure I saw. Were they leading me somewhere? It felt like a game, and I was playing along without even knowing the rules. I must have walked for what felt like hours. My flashlight started to dim, and I began to feel lost, unsure if I was even heading in the right direction anymore. But just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A campsite. It was hidden in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so thick that no one would have ever found it unless they were looking. There was an old, tattered tent, half collapsed from age, and scattered around it were clothes, food wrappers, and personal items, wallets, shoes, even photographs. But what was strange was that these things didn't all belong to one person. They were from different people. I felt sick. Who had been living out here, collecting these things? Why hadn't anyone reported them missing? I searched the camp, but there was no one there. The air was heavy with the feeling of being watched, though. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to leave. I radioed for backup, but by the time anyone arrived, the camp looked like it had been abandoned for years. There was no sign of the person I had chased, and no one had reported any missing items from the neighborhood. I went back to the station that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been led out there, that whoever or whatever was living in those woods knew exactly what they were doing. It's been years and I still think about that night. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see the camp, the eerie stillness of the woods, and that shadowy figure slipping deeper into the darkness. I'll never know who they were or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: someone was out there watching, and they were never caught. My name is Jake, and I'm 47 years old. I used to work as a police officer in a small town in Oregon. I've seen a lot during my years on the force, but there's one night that still haunts me. Even after I left the job, it was supposed to be just another routine call, but it turned into something I'll never forget. It was late, around 2 a.m. when the call came in. A few neighbors had reported hearing the sound of children playing at the old abandoned playground on the edge of town. The thing is, that playground hadn't been used in years. It was overgrown, rusted, and forgotten. No one went there anymore, especially not in the middle of the night. I drove out there, expecting it to be nothing, a prank, or maybe some wild animals. When I arrived, everything was silent. The swing set was still standing, but the chains were rusted, and the seats were covered in moss. The only sound was the wind making one of the swings creak back and forth. There were no kids, no signs of life at all. I was about to head back to my car when I noticed something strange. Small footprints in the dirt, leading away from the swings and toward the woods. They were fresh, and there were several sets, all tiny, like children had been running through the area. My gut told me something was wrong, so I followed the trail. The footprints led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thick, and the light from my flashlight barely made a dent in the darkness. As I walked, I started noticing things scattered along the path. Old toys, dolls with missing eyes, torn up clothes that looked like they had been there for years. The further I went, the more unsettling it became. The toys and clothes were mixed with other strange things: drawings on pieces of crumpled paper, old shoes, and what looked like makeshift shelters made out of branches and leaves. Someone had been living out here, and from the looks of it, they had children with them. My heart started racing. I didn't know what to think. Was it a homeless camp? Or something worse? I felt like I was being watched, like someone or something was out there in the woods, hiding just out of sight. I called for backup, but before anyone arrived, the trail went cold. The footprints and scattered belongings led to a clearing, but there was no one there. No children, no adults, just silence. When my chief and the others got there, we searched the entire area, but we didn't find anything more. The case was closed with no explanation. No missing children had been reported, and no one in town seemed to know anything about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come close to something terrible that night. Even now, years later, I still think about that playground, those tiny footprints, and the eerie silence of the woods. I wonder what I almost stumbled upon that night, and if those children were ever found, or if they're still out there, somewhere in the dark.